Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you for inviting me today. My name is Professor Anna Stec. I'm Professor in Fire Chemistry and Toxicity, and I work at the University of Central Lancashire. Today, my talk will be on firefighters' exposure to toxic fire effluents. There is no debate that firefighters' occupation is one of the most hazardous ones, particularly looking at a replacement of the natural products with the plastics over the last decade. And we know that widespread use of plastic not only increases the growth and severity of the fires, but also it produced much higher concentration and different types of the toxicants that will pose a threat to a human. And yet, if we look at the regulations, we know fire smoke is the biggest killer in fires. However, outside of mass transportation, is completely unregulated. Therefore, if we've got any fire, it's very difficult to identify what fire toxins are released and what potential effect they might have on a human. There are two major factors affecting exposure, and that's fire scenario, that's ventilation condition. So, for example, non-flaming or flaming, and fuel. And having those two things in terms of the fire condition and fuel, we can expect different combination of fire effluents and different concentrations, different types, and different profile. Additionally to that, depending on a fuel, we will have, depending on their chemical reactions, we will have also exposure in terms of the gases and particulate matter. That means it's in a gas and it's in the atmosphere. We've got also within the longer term deposition on the soil or water runoff. And then we've got also contamination from fire debris. Additionally to the firefighter exposure to smoke, we're looking at their practices and also workplace conditions and so on, which I'm going to cover a bit later on in a more detail. In terms of the toxicological evaluation, we classify fire toxicants as acute, those ones which would have immediate effect, and chronic, which would take a time to lead to the health outcome. And that means long-term toxicants. And depending on a fuel, we might expect different types of toxicants. So for example, if we've got nitrogen-containing fuel, such as polyurethane foam or polyisocyanated foam, they containing nitrogen. So fire emissions that we expect would be such as hydrogen cyanide, nitrogen oxides, ammonia. If we go for the PVC, polyvinyl chloride, for example, window frame, that contains chlorine. So the gases that would be in a major distribution would be hydrochloric acid. Every single fire would produce carbon monoxide and particulate matter. And also in terms of the chronic toxicants, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, that's what we clearly can see as a soot. In terms of the chronic toxicants, the most common ones that we are aware of, such as dioxins, furans coming from halogenated products. Similarly, flame retardants, which are also halogenated, so contain chlorine, bromine, or phosphorus. We've got perfluorinated chemicals such as PFAS or metals. And depending on the type of the toxicant, they will have also the different health outcome. So in terms of the toxicological endpoint, we can look at the carcinogenic effect that leads to cancer. We can have, for example, respiratory effect that's got effect on lungs, cardiovascular on heart, and so on. There is really huge, wide amount of the studies coming from US and Canada. And in those countries, we already have presumptive legislation which linking firefighter occupation to cancer. However, within the most recent years, we can see much greater activity. And that was expressed, for example, in 2018, where President Donald Trump signed legislation which required set up registry of firefighters just to track their links between the workplace exposure and cancers. Last year, International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, World Health Organization, actually found direct link and classified occupational exposure as a firefighter to be carcinogenic. And in December last year, the US Senate actually approved the act to provide automatic workers' compensation benefits. That means that in a close future, firefighters do not have to do any longer present evidence on their exposure during their career to carcinogens. However, very little has been done in Europe or in UK. In Europe, the most widely studies are coming from Scandinavian countries and really well documented. However, in the UK, there was very, very little published till within the last few years. And so UCLAN was commissioned by the Fire Brigades Union to see or identify association, if any, between fire toxicants exposure and the increased occurrence of cancers and diseases among firefighters, which were really well documented in other countries. And the outcome was just that we can offer preventative health monitoring, education and support that is specifically designed to protect firefighters' health. The first part of the work was actually to carry on a contamination survey. That took 3 months, 3 years ago. It's covered 64 questions. We opened only this to the serving firefighters because we wanted to know the current state and awareness or culture behaviours amongst UK firefighters. We were really enormously impressed because we managed to get around 11,000 responses. That's more or less around 24% of the UK workforce. The parts that we cover in the survey were demographics, but also workplace contamination, contaminants on the personal protective equipment in terms of its own. We also look at the health in terms of the cancer and mental health, and culture and awareness. And that's what I'm going to discuss a little bit more on my further slides. All those results that I'm presenting today are already published. They are open publications, so it means that anyone can access and download them. And they are kind of referenced at the bottom of the screen. So if we look for the part 1, we look actually at the firefighters and contaminants at the workplace. We found that only 1/3 of firefighters actually clean their PPE after every incident. Almost half of firefighters indicating clean and dirty PPE is not stored separately, which means that there is cross-contamination and the firefighters' exposure to those contaminants. More than half of firefighters, we learned also that they store fire gloves within other items of PPE, such as helmets, boots, tunic, trousers or pockets. That means that if you've got gloves in the helmet, you exposing your hair and your head skin to the contaminants that might be then having a further health outcome. The other thing we learned, which was a bit more worrying, is that 84% of firefighters told us that they often or sometimes attend fires without respiratory protection. And that actually shows lack of enforcement, because the major things that came out, as you can see on the graph, came from the habit. Nobody else wears it. I don't have to wear it, so I chose not to, which kind of is begging a question: do we have really policy or any guidance that would be enforced to make sure that actually firefighters can protect themselves from those exposures to those contaminants? Sadly, on the part 2, where we look at the cancer, we found that over 4% of UK serving firefighters who responded to the survey, they have already been diagnosed with the cancer. And the other information you could learn was that the most dominant type of the cancer was skin. And skin actually indicates dermal intake or absorption of toxins through the skin, rather than respiratory types of cancers. The other types of cancers that we also learned were rare type of cancers, which normally wouldn't be diagnosed in an early age in the general public. We also learned, and you can see on this graph, that there is some link to contaminants at the workplace for firefighters. So in other words, odds ratio, as you got at the bottom, actually links the likelihood of developing cancer. So if it's higher than 1, it means that those firefighters who have been diagnosed with the cancer and they clarified that in the survey, they were compared to the firefighters who have not been diagnosed with the cancer. So if it's higher than 1, it means that there is statistical significance and likelihood of developing cancer. And what we learned is that the firefighters who served more than 15 years, they had around twice likelihood of developing cancer. Then closely related to the workplace exposure to contaminants such as cleaning not taken seriously at the workplace, no separation of PPE between clean and dirty zones, smell of fire at the workplace, or the other ones. But the other things we also learned that it's also linked to the personal decontamination, such as firefighters eating in contaminated PPE. That's kind of likelihood of developing cancer also almost twice. And remaining in personal protective equipment for 4 hours after incident, or soot in nose and throat for over a day, which kind of is also around 2 times higher. We also looked at the mental health of firefighters. Obviously, there is a lot of data on the mental health that is linked to the stress or the traumatic events, but there is really little known in terms of the correlations to the fire contaminants or emissions. So we looked at the firefighters' mental health compared to the English population. And what we learned, as you can see on a graph, the blue one is for the surveyed firefighters' response and the orange is for the English population. We learned that any mental health conditions is really dominant across amongst firefighters, particularly anxiety and depression, which is almost twice or 3 times higher. The other thing that we also looked just briefly was part 4, where we look at the badge of honor, which kind of links us to the culture and awareness on contaminants. And we learned that within the firefighters' majority, they believe, or the others believe, that there is badge of honor amongst the fire rescue service. And as quite interesting, you can see that almost half firefighters told us that, yes, it is not me who believes in badge of honor, it's the others. The other factors that we link to the culture and awareness were the firefighters who personally viewed contamination as a badge of honor. They were at least twice as likely to eat with sooty hands, notice soot in nose and throat for a prolonged time, and also smell fire smoke on the body for more than a day, which indicates that the fire contaminants exposure was much higher, and therefore it might also lead to the health outcomes in a future. Additionally, we learned that there was really lack of awareness on the contaminants issue, particularly lack of training and their health outcomes that are strongly associated with increased smoke contaminants exposure. At that point with the survey, we identified only really 2 stations or 2 brigades, fire brigades, that provided training on the fire contaminants and their health outcomes. So the more recent data that came out this year, we actually look at the cancer amongst Scottish male firefighters, and that was for 20 years, from 2000 to 2020. And what we learned is that the firefighters' death, over 42% of firefighters who are dying, they're dying from cancer, which we call in different meaning malignant neoplasms. That's very closely followed with the circulatory system diseases, which are 28%. Circulatory diseases, in majority, that's heart attack and stroke. That was closely followed with the other diseases such as respiratory. And respiratory diseases linked to the lungs, only 6%. That can be linked because within the big fire incident, firefighters do wear breathing apparatus. And then we've got also the other types of diseases which are kind of in minority. In terms of the cancers, we really learned that there are specific cancers that are much greater than general public. So we learned, for example, that prostate, leukemia, there are 2-3 times higher than where we compare to the Scottish population. If we've got cancer with not known location, that's almost 6 times higher when we compare to the Scottish population. Additionally, we learned that the firefighters getting cancer much earlier in life when we compare to Scottish population. And we're talking much earlier, we're talking about 15 years earlier. So the top peak of cancer mortalities are between 45 to 49 years old. When we take general public, it's around 70, 74, or even higher depending on type of the cancer. Additionally, we learned that the firefighters have multiple exposure and routes of exposure. So it's not only by the inhalation of the toxicants, but it's also digestion and it's also skin absorption. And the final thing is that majority of the firefighters who die at that early age, they actually diagnosed with the rare cancers. That recovery is very poor and diagnosis is too late, which actually, when we look at the health screening firefighters, that kind of is introduced in the US and Canada from 45 years old. And one of the things that I want to emphasize from our data is that the true relative risk is really probably larger than what we reported, because not all the firefighter occupation is not recorded for every single firefighter. That means that when we're looking at the death certificate and when the firefighter retires and finding another job, the firefighter occupation is not recorded. And therefore, all the data, all the cases are not reported. So just to finalize today, within the conclusions, I think there are three major parts that really need to be looked carefully. First of all is really better decontamination policies. That really something what I provided you, that 85% of firefighters do not wear respiratory protection. That really needs to be enforced through the culture change, increasing awareness, but also introducing something like a guidance or policy. In terms of the preventative health monitoring, currently with the Fire Brigades Union, we are doing health monitoring across the UK for 1,000 firefighters. So we can provide a health package that will be looking at the early detection of cancers amongst UK firefighters. So those cancers can be detected early and firefighters have a chances to recover and come back to their normal life. And on those notes, I will thank you for your attention and probably looking forward for questions. Thank you.
Welcome back to Firebuyer Live. My name's Rebecca Spain and I'm the Managing Editor here at International Firebuyer. So I'm here with Professor Anna Stec after her presentation on the occupational health risks in firefighters and the preventative measures to minimise their exposure in fire toxins. So Professor Stec, why Firebuyer Live?
That's an interesting question. I do think that it is really interesting platform that we're having after the COVID. That you can disseminate results much wider and probably much more effective way, especially looking at your audience that it will come and listen it. Obviously, my talk cover only firefighters, but it's not really only firefighters who are attending the fire incidents. You've got also the different agencies. And probably that's the reason why I actually sent a short abstract to you saying that it would be really good if you can disseminate and share about what we've done and how we can actually work together.
Perfect, thank you. So how did you end up where you are now?
Well, how did I end up? So I started a while ago. From the background, I'm a chemist, and I started looking at the analytical chemistry, so the fire emissions from different products. So I started in a very friendly world, combustible insulation materials. Looking at the toxicity and toxic emissions. Then I looked closely at the flame retardants, and somehow that I thought I will have a little bit of break. I moved to firefighter world. Yes, that's also very interesting world that is around us. So there is still also taking it a little bit more serious. There is a lot to be done, and we actually have a catching game with the other countries at the moment. And I do believe that fire toxicity is important.
Most definitely. So the results of the survey that you discussed in your presentation are actually quite shocking. How can we enforce this change in training and awareness? And is this a legislative change?
I think there are two aspects. One is start working together. And what do I mean by that is that different agencies, different sectors really need to get together to address the issue. Because really, realistically, if I'm talking about fire toxicity, that's for the over 2 decades, it is elephant in a room. And really, there is a lot of issues with that to be addressed, something what we can see clearly from the Grenfell Tower fire. From the legislative perspective, we typically in the UK, we've got for the presumptive legislation, for example, for firefighters, we need to document and evidence that firefighters have cancers twice higher, which we did. And that's kind of up to the government to take an action and progress that. In terms of the firefighters' exposure to contaminants, that means that policy needs to be, or kind of some type of the guidance needs to be really enforced to make sure that firefighters starting changing their habits.
So how can health monitoring be adapted quickly?
The first thing that I've got, that obviously you've got US and Canada that are offering health monitoring, but I want to be very careful with that, because when we look at the Canadians and Americans, they've got different types of fuels, and therefore different types of toxicants, leading to slightly different types of cancers. So the predominance of the cancer's incidence and cancer mortality might be and is slightly different than we've got in the UK. So what we're doing with Fire Brigades Union is that project for the next 24 months, where we monitoring blood and urine from 1,000 firefighters and screening for almost every single type of the cancer and disease to identify the best health package that can be then introduced and hopefully implemented in the UK.
And what are the current chemicals used in PPE?
So there is a lot of different types of chemicals, but the most common in the firefighters PPE are perfluorinated chemicals, PFAS, which are identified that they have a deleterious effect on the health. However, what I want to stress is that because we do not regulate chemicals in terms of what is put into the product, so if we look even more general class gas phase halogenated flame retardants, which are put in the upholstery furniture, for example, because we do not regulate what chemicals are put in, and we do not regulate fire toxicity, what's coming off, it's really, we will not know how dangerous it is until it's got the effect.
And so what further research needs to be conducted in your field in regards to long-term firefighting health?
I think probably where we're looking is, as I mentioned, health monitoring that ideally would be introduced and giving firefighters chances to recover and actually to discover that cancer early enough. And I would say probably that's the top on my agenda at the moment through the research. The other aspects that I'm looking at with the Fire Brigades Union is wildland fires and high occurrence of the cardiovascular diseases, such as heart attack and stroke. Because wildland fires, especially when we've got in the UK, they are really different than, big Californian fires. In the UK, you've got mostly smoldering fires, which toxicologically, they will release much bigger cocktail of toxicants with potential deleterious health effect. So that's something that we really should start working on, looking at the emissions and their health on the firefighter, particularly that firefighters do not wear necessary protection during those fires. And then use of chemicals, that's another big issue.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Professor Stec. It's been really nice to ask you further questions about your presentation. I do invite all of you attending to please connect with her on the platform if you have any further questions. Thank you.
Thank you for your invite. Thank you.